Festival, organised by CPRE London. My name's Paul Wood. I'm one of the organisers of the Urban Tree Festival. The Urban Tree Festival is running until tomorrow. Today is our penultimate day. There's still events you can book onto, so do have a look at our website at urbantreefestival.org. The Urban Tree Festival is run entirely by volunteers, and if you're able to contribute to our costs of the ongoing costs of running the festival, we'd very much appreciate it. We'll be putting some links in the chat for donations and other information during this webinar. There is a Q&A, so if you've got questions, please put your questions for the panelists into the Q&A. Otherwise, I'm going to shut up and hand over to Neil Sinden, who's the director of CPRE London.
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many of you with us. I can still see people joining, so we'll wait a minute or two before we start the formalities. But just to say, I'm delighted to welcome you to this penultimate day of the Urban Tree Festival, and one of the webinars that I've been most looking forward to of the series that we've put together for you. CPRE London, for those that aren't aware, is a branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, the countryside charity. We operate in London, and we are all about promoting a greener city, and that means many things, but in particular it means bringing the countryside closer to people in London, both in a physical and sort of metaphorical sense, and in terms of understanding and promoting awareness and understanding of the countryside and the characteristics of the countryside that one can find within cities, even large cities such as London. And of course, urban orchards have become quite an important feature of many parts of London and other cities, and I'm delighted that we're able to talk with some experts about this issue this afternoon. The idea of community orchards was first promoted by the arts conservation charity Common Ground over 30 years ago. And since then, the planting of fruit trees in urban areas, I think, has grown significantly. This expansion follows the decline of commercial orchards across much of southern England. But it's fantastic now that community orchards are such a feature of urban green spaces. So I'm looking forward to this discussion of the value of fruit trees and community orchards in urban areas from all sorts of different perspectives. And I'm going to hand over now to the first of our panelists, who is Jo Homan, training manager at the Orchard Project, who will be talking to us about the work that she does and the work of the wider organisation. Over to you, Jo.
Hi everyone, my name is Jo Homan. I am the Education, Training and Skills Manager for the Orchard Project. I also set up and run Edible Landscapes London in Finsbury Park, which is a forest garden project. So I do have specialist knowledge about forest gardens, but also lots of experience of setting up training courses, and in particular forest garden training courses and orchard management training courses, which I'll tell you more about later. So the Orchard Project is a charity that has about 15 employees. We're based in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and soon we'll be opening up in Swansea as well. We have people all over the place that are supporting people to plant and maintain orchards. That's our kind of goal. On the picture there, you can see some of the orchards that we've worked with in London, either planting or restoring. And our mission statement is developing resilient communities with the skills to plant, care for and harvest fruit trees, helping us to rediscover the pleasure of eating homegrown fruit. And in this short talk, I'll be explaining how the Orchard Project pans out that vision, and also talking about how our emphasis is shifting slightly to include biodiversity and also orchards that are more like polycultures. So let me tell you what we do. I'm trying to move to the next slide and it's not working.
I need to click on the PowerPoint.
Ah, yeah, press the down arrow.
Click click on the PowerPoint, that's it.
So orchards, the obvious thing about orchards that we all know about is the apples and the yields that come from them, the kind of the tangible assets. We have had a link with Bulmer's cider, and so that's why perhaps randomly there's a picture of Peter Andre with our Manchester project manager Dan, because there was a kind of a promotion there at one of the orchards where a makeover happened. Orchards are also wonderful places for learning about nature and wildlife and how to look after fruit trees, so we do plenty of informal and formal training. They also are places where we can bring people together to celebrate, to work to care for the trees, to connect with nature. Also ways of people connecting with their local area, so the history of the area, which I think is the kind of thing Peter's going to be talking about in his mulberry talk. So maybe what apple varieties were developed in your area, can you include them in your community orchard, so that kind of thing. And they also have obvious environmental benefits. They offer lots of ecosystem services. So more about all of these things now. So the food and drink side of things, the kind of the food resilience. So we have a cider house up in Walthamstow where we press apples that are collected in London, and we make a cider called Local Fox Cider. You can now buy this cider online. There's a new website called Pedal Me Supermarket, so pedal as in bike pedal, because this service cycles to your house and delivers the food, including perhaps some cider. And you can buy our Local Fox Rambler cider and our Local Fox Medium. They're both about 6% and they cost £3. So that's a new thing. I literally just found out about this today. It's a fantastic news. So yeah, cider is brilliant and a wonderful output of orchards, but there are of course lots of edible yields as well, and those could be taken even further, as I will explain later. Orchards in cities are really important places for bringing people together. So we support a large number of community groups all over the place to plant, to restore, to care for their orchards. We give them practical support and advice. We sometimes give money. So last year we ran a microfunder where we gave £400 to lots of community groups across London that they could just use to support their local orchard, which was fantastic. Sometimes if we get funding, we're able to work with a geographical area or a particular demographic, and then we give quite a high level of support to community groups. And we take a couple of people from each group and we give them training, and we call them orchard leaders is our kind of jargon for them, because they're sort of leading their local orchard, and they get additional support from us to support their one local orchard. But there are some people for whom one orchard just isn't enough, and we call these people orchard mentors, and they get extra training from us and extra support, and we have the very enjoyable job of linking up, a bit like a kind of an orchard dating service, these orchard mentors with other orchards that needs kind of additional help. So in the pictures here you can see some orchard mentors that are in West London learning about veteran tree care with the expert Bob Lever. And on the right, there's an orchard up in Lordship Rec, and the orchard leader there is an orchard mentor as well. She's called Sally, and she looks after about 5 other orchards in North London as well. And so we've got about 20 orchard mentors in London. We've got 9 in Leeds, where we used to have an office there, but we don't at the moment. And we've got 10 orchard mentors in Edinburgh. So it's a really great model because it extends our reach much further beyond our own limited capacity. We also like to bring people into orchards to celebrate. So, you know, wassailing at the end of winter is a wonderful celebration. Blossom Day, the Harvest Festival in the autumn. We also wanted to celebrate the cultural heritage of apples by running a festival down in Merton, which we did a couple of years ago, called Merton Fruit Festival, because you may not realise this, but this kind of unglamorous part of London used to be the fruit kind of mecca when the John Innes Research Institute was based there, and they developed loads of plum, cherry and apple cultivars and pear cultivars as well. So we celebrated that, and of course you have to include apple bobbing if you're ever going to have a festival like that. We also do lots of training, as I mentioned before. We work with children and schools, we work with adults and apprentices. We have a large number of lesson plans on our website that teachers can anyone can download, that are ones that we tried out as part of a big project a few years ago. And we do lots of one-off training days because there's so many things you can learn about orchards, you know, the biodiversity, the apple identification, pruning, grafting, all of the aspects of tree care, orchard design, all of those things. So we've run lots of training on that. We've also tried our hand at doing wellbeing activities in orchards. So we did orchard bathing last year, for example. This year we've started running some training weekends that go into a greater level of detail. We've got a training coming up in July that is on orchard survey and design. We've got one in August that is on soil care and biodiversity. Both of those take place over a weekend. And for this kind of training we charge because we use that money to try and pay for the free training we give our orchard leaders and our orchard mentors. So to go into a greater level of detail, even more, for people who are really keen on orchards, we run an accredited training course, which I developed, which is called the Certificate in Community Orcharding, which is a level 3 training course. It takes place over 12 days, and it covers all aspects of orchard care and design, including veteran tree care. If we've run this course 5 times, we're in the middle of our 5th iteration at the moment. We've got a 6th one starting in August. The most recent 2 courses have purely been for people who are unemployed and economically inactive. And these courses have done really well at attracting a good range of different people, lots of different backgrounds. And though the people come away from it, some of them go into employment, some of them go into further training, some of them just end up managing their own orchard in a really, really efficient manner. And they also form a very nice network within themselves. So the people who've been through this training course, a lot of them are friends with each other. Some of them go on to become orchard mentors. And they also end up being very connected to lots of different orchards within London because we travel all over the place to teach people various different skills. So yeah, to take this training even further, we are bringing it online, and that is what I'm spending a lot of my time doing at the moment. So I'm creating a lot of video content, PowerPoints with narration, and there'll be PDFs and quizzes. So instead of doing 12 face-to-face days, students will be doing 5 face-to-face days to practice the practical skills like grafting and pruning. And the rest of it they'll be able to learn online and still gain this level 3 qualification. So that is launching in September or October, something like that, depending on how quickly we get things put together. And once we've got that established, we're going to add another training course, which will be probably a level 2 award in forest gardening. This is a bit of an announcement, actually. We've only just made this partnership with the Agroforestry Research Trust to deliver the training in forest gardening, and that will be launching in spring next year. So it's been a really busy year for us in terms of extending our training offer. So this is the last slide with any content. I'm going to explain a bit about what there's a lot of information here. So the idea is that if you take orchards a bit further and turn them into polycultures, things start to get very, very interesting. And it's a relatively recent shift in emphasis for the orchard project, but the arguments for it are very compelling, because when you make an orchard more of a polyculture, you start making orchards into part of the solution for food security, and you also give a massive boost to biodiversity by doing this. So I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean here. So if you imagine your normal existing orchard, group of plum trees and cherry trees and apple trees, and imagine planting a shelter belt around the outside of that orchard which will act as protection for the orchard against the wind and increased humidity, and also act as a habitat. And then if you add in a pond and some other biodiversity features like log piles and things like that, and then if you add in compost loo, where you can use the human urine to act as a fertilizer for your plants. And then if you, under your fruit trees, add in some shrubs, so maybe some berry bushes and things like that, throw in some herbaceous perennials, so those plants that come back every year like horseradish, things like that, and add some ground cover plants like, I don't know, strawberries, things like that, and some climbers, then you're starting to get what's called a polyculture, a mixture of several different plants, or you may call it a forest garden or a food forest. Doesn't really matter, it's the way forwards for community orchards. It means that you can have wild garlic in spring, blackcurrants in summer, and apples in the autumn, which means you've got these multiple yields over the whole year instead of just one yield in the autumn. And it means that, say your plums and your sea beets do really badly one year, it doesn't matter so much because your grapes and your medlars and your, I don't know, your strawberries do really well. And so you're spreading your risk out, meaning that you're always getting some kind of yield. And it means that you're making the most efficient use of the space that you've got available because you're stacking up plants in this vertical way. And that means that you've also got this opportunity to experiment with lots of different plants because there's loads of different plants available to use in a forest garden or a food forest. And then if you've got this complex system of all these different plants and all these different layers and the ponds and all those different features, it means that you're creating tons of different ecological niches. You're creating shelter and you're creating food that's available for a wide range of invertebrates and birds and mammals and amphibians and everything. So of course you're then really helping with biodiversity. You've got all those food yields as well. And if it's a very complex system, it means that it will be more resilient to the external shocks that any orchard will get because of climate change. So actually this slide title should be Polyculture equals biodiversity, which equals resilience. And we're talking about resilience in lots of different ways here. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the end of my time. If you want to ask me any questions about the cider house or about the training or about polycultures, I'll happily answer them now or later on. But hopefully I've explained how the Orchard Project teaches people about orchards and supports them, and also helps people rediscover the pleasures of freshly grown fruit. I'll hand over back to, I think, you, Neil.
Yes, thanks, Jo. Fascinating, really interesting presentation, and really interesting to see that the direction that the Orchard Project is going with polycultures. And I, for one, are in desperate need of some orchard bathing at the moment, so we may come back to that. Right, we're going to now hand over to Peter Coles. Before doing so, just wanted to emphasise that if you can post your questions in the Q&A panel, that would be wonderful. We've already got a few, which is good, and there's some interesting questions that are coming up here. So we'll come back to those, if it's okay, once we've heard from Peter and Derek. So Peter, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us about your expertise in mulberries.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, Jo. Thank you, Neil. I'm conscious of time and conscious that we need to have plenty of time for questions. So I will try to go fairly quickly through this. So I'm Peter Coles, and in 2016 with the Conservation Foundation, I set up a project called Morus Londinium, which some of you may be familiar with Heritage Lottery funding for 2 years. And the idea of that was to document, plot and preserve London's mulberry tree heritage for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons that I was very interested in, not only these are very special trees, but often they harbour within them. Their roots are in gardens which have disappeared. So it's a way, if you find an old mulberry tree, of discovering something about local history. And rather than talk about that here, if any of you are more interested and want to go to the website Morus Londinium, you will find this map which you can use or you can add to, but you will also, by clicking on each of these, when it says 12, it means there are 12 trees in this area, mulberry trees, you should get information on individual trees, and the older ones, there can be quite a lot of story there, and you can also add to it if you wish. Now, in this talk, when we're talking about mulberry orchards, we're really talking about mulberries grown for fruit, and that really means black mulberries. And there are two kinds of mulberry, really. Well, actually, there are many more than that. There are at least 3 main species: black, white, and red, but there are many other subspecies as well. The black mulberry is the one that's grown for fruit and always has been. Now, Roger Saul, who founded the famous Mulberry clothing and fashion company, when he was asked in a Radio 4 interview why he chose the name mulberry, one was the reason that there was a mulberry tree outside the school he went to in Bath, which actually is where the mulberry harbours were planned, the famous mulberry harbours. But also he said he was looking for a quintessentially English tree to give the name to the company, and he chose mulberry because he felt it was a very sort of typically English. But of course, the mulberry is not English tree; it's not native here. In fact, it's very rare. There are just a few thousand in the whole country. Originally, the black mulberry comes from what used to be the Persian Empire, now Iran, and the whole bunch of countries off to the east of that, and then very quickly settled in Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. And it was brought to England not by James I, although that was a watershed moment in 1609, but by the Romans in the 1st century. And we know that because mineralized pips have been found in archaeological digs by the Thames. And the other main mulberry, which is not the one we're going to be talking about here, is the white mulberry, and that one is the Chinese, Japanese, Korean native, and it is grown for its leaves, and the fruit is not particularly tasty. It can be preserved and dried and stored, and there is an industry now of shipping mulberry fruit around the world. There are hardly any white mulberry trees in Britain. There are increasing numbers of them. It makes quite a nice street tree, but the fruit is not interesting, whereas the black mulberry fruit is interesting. But the black mulberry, unlike what people often think, will also serve as food. The leaves will serve as food for silkworms, but that's not what we're going to talk about here. Now, mulberry orchards are extremely rare, and they always have been. And anyone who has a mulberry tree or knows of one knows that they produce so much fruit, you hardly need an orchard unless you actually want to make jam out of them or bottle them up and sell them on. One of the only mulberry orchards I know is the Tiptree Mulberry Orchard in Essex. And you can visit it during the season, and I don't think you can pick the fruit, but you can certainly buy mulberry jam there. Now, mulberry trees have been grown not as whole orchards, but as orchard trees, and they've been grown since Roman times. The mulberries that the Romans brought over were grown in villas as belonging to wealthy Romans. But there is evidence that mulberry trees continued to be a very interesting component part of orchards all throughout the Middle Ages after the Romans had left in the 5th century. And we have some kind of like leftover memories of these in surviving ruins and sites of monasteries, around the country. And I'm going to talk about London and Greater London here. Any of you who know Southeast London will know of Lesness Abbey, and that basically is the site of a 12th century monastery, possibly founded out of guilt and remorse for the murder of Thomas à Becket, who actually, the knights who killed him apparently hung their cloaks in a mulberry tree. And there is an extremely old and huge mulberry tree in the grounds of Canterbury Cathedral. Now, this is it's not surviving from the 12th century, but this is an old, very old black mulberry tree on the site of Lesness Abbey ruins, which you can visit. There's now a fence around it. Charterhouse, which is near Smithfield's Market, again, is 14th century priory. and it does have some mulberry trees in it now. These, again, this one is a survivor, not of the original monastery. There probably aren't any. I think I know of some, and we'll look at those in a few minutes. But these are in Preacher's Court in Charterhouse, which you can also visit. This one has lost a limb, apparently, and it apparently is also a scion of, or a cutting of Milton's so-called mulberry in Christ's College in Cambridge, and it was planted about 180 years ago. And every July, the brothers, because it's now an almshouse, who live at Charterhouse, make a gift of the first harvest of mulberry fruit from their tree to the Lord Mayor of London. Not the Mayor of London, but the Lord Mayor of the City of London. Across the road from Charterhouse is St Bartholomew the Great, and you can see up here there is an indication of the presence of a mulberry garden which would have belonged to the infirmary, and this was very often why mulberry trees were planted there. Juice and other parts of them, roots and leaves, can all be very useful as medicines and the sources of vitamins and so on. So they were often grown in monastery infirmary gardens. And there is a mulberry tree roughly where the garden used to be. This is quite a young tree. It's probably about 1960s or something, 50s. But it's on the site of where the mulberry garden was. And a very old tree was actually uprooted when some development work was going on in the 19th century. If you travel across town now to Sion Abbey, you'll see this walled garden, and just about here, where two walls join, is this tree. And this is a very old mulberry tree, and it may be the only left remaining remnant of this garden, this Tudor garden here. But just further on, round the corner here, in a private part of the house, is a mulberry orchard. It's the only mulberry orchard I know of, apart from Tiptree. And this mulberry orchard we know is 1611, and probably before then, and possibly even part of the Bridgetine monastery, which preceded it from the 15th century. And you can see that it's old because this is not a grove of trees, but it's one tree which is layered. The branches have collapsed and they're growing up new stems. This, for me, is the most extraordinary mulberry-related place that I've ever seen, and I love this place. I go back to it again and again, and I'm now mapping it and charting it and hoping to revive it with some people and help from the Duchess of Northumberland. If we fly back over London again, go back to Greenwich, you'll see here there's a place called the Queen's Orchard, which is a lovely place to go when COVID and all the rest of it has moved on. And you can look at this lovely restored orchard here at the north end, northwest tip near Maze Hill tube station, railway station rather. And in the centre of this is a very old mulberry tree also. Some people think it's only 19th century, and it could be a lot older. I'm going into that as well. James I did actually offer a watershed moment for the history of the mulberry tree in Britain, and notably in England, when he tried to start a silk industry and imported tens of thousands of mulberry trees from Languedoc and other places in France and Belgium and the Netherlands. And he imported black mulberries, not because it was a silly or mistake or the French were tricking him, but it's a more resilient tree. And black mulberries were the basis of the Spanish, French, Italian, Greek, Persian silk industries for centuries until the 15th century, when the white mulberry eventually appeared, was introduced from China. He wanted to set the example by planting mulberries so that the Lord Lieutenants out in the Shires would do the same. And he planted a mulberry garden next to what is now Buckingham Palace, but which was then part of St James's Palace. St James is here. And you can see on a map here, I can't see the day, 1651, you can see a map of a mulberry garden, which is now in the possession of part of the Royal Collection. And there are none of these trees that were planted then surviving. The most recent one is the oldest one in the Buckingham Palace Gardens is about 100 years old, 120 years old. But another plantation that James I started was probably at Charlton House, of which one mulberry tree survives today. And John Evelyn, who lived in Deptford, not very far away, planned the garden, and he marked on it an orchard tree, and there were a mulberry tree, not as an orchard tree, but not as part of an orchard, but as an individual tree. And a tree is still surviving on the site now of John Evelyn's home in Deptford. We fly over a bit to Chelsea and find Thomas More, and Morus. Here there was a pun and a play on words on the name of Thomas More. Morus is the mulberry species, and this was a development really of Thomas More's house in Chelsea. And if you look at the top here, you'll see this area, and that survived for quite a long time after this bit was demolished and built upon. This is Lindsay House down here, and Beaufort House, it became known as, was here. But this bit up here was called, eventually it was sold to somebody called Lord Wharton. And you can see this area here, Lord Wharton's field, and you can see the area on the other map here. And Lord Wharton's field got turned into a 1700s mulberry plantation with 2,000 mulberry trees, about 1,000 black and 1,000 white, I think, as part of the Raw Silk Industries company's efforts to grow mulberry leaves again for a native silk industry in 1720. By 1723, it had gone bankrupt. And this area was sold off for development. However, as through the Morus Londinium project and asking people to tell me about mulberry trees they know, I've discovered this one in End Park Gardens and also very many others in Chelsea. And this one is a survivor of that original. It's a black mulberry, and it's a survivor of that effort to start a silk industry. Abundance London has been mapping mulberry trees and other fruit trees in Chiswick area, and I recently gave a presentation on Chiswick, and there is a mulberry tree which dates back to probably the 18th century and possibly earlier, part of Morley Hall, which was next to Chiswick House, and this is in the walled garden that was part of that of the original house on the site there. If you wanted to find anything resembling an orchard today, and I was going to make a bit of a joke, but I'll come back to that in a second, you could do worse than go to either St James's Park, where there are a number of black mulberry trees right next to some white mulberry trees, or indeed Kensington Gardens, where there are 14 white mulberries and I think 8 or 10 black mulberries on the other side. So if you want to see a lot of mulberry trees, then go to Kensington Gardens. I'm very pleased to be on this platform with Derek Mann and Jo. I've worked with the Urban Orchard on foraging expeditions a few years ago, and Derek Mann is also a fellow at Goldsmiths, where I am, and is a photographer, and he's done some really interesting work with the Urban Orchard, with the Orchard Project also. So there's an interesting connection between the three of us, which we weren't conscious of at first. Through the Morus Londinium project, we do organise foraging. Mulberry fruit are only really available for 2 months of the year, July and August. It's a messy business, but I'm hoping we can do that again. And if not, refer to the Morus Londinium map, find mulberry trees near you and go out and get messy and have fun. This is the map. And what I was going to say is that Paul Wood has produced a couple of really fantastic books. One of them is called London is a Forest, and I think you could also say that London is an orchard. And this is one of the species, the mulberry, that you can see and you can find out where they are. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Wow, 2 amazing talks. I'm beginning to think we should have had 3 separate webinars. But before moving on, just to say thanks enormously for that, and to say that I'm delighted that we have a photographer now next to give us a presentation. I was privileged to have researched some of the orchards and the old orchards in the southwest of the country with James Revilius, the well-known landscape photographer, a number of years ago when I was working with Common Ground, and so I'm delighted now that we can hear from Derek Mann and from his contemporary approach to photographing orchards. Over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Neil. I'm just going to share my screen. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Derek Mann, and I'm here to talk about my project, What Do You See, Old Apple Tree? I would like to start with a short video that I got here. Hopefully this.
wanted to capture the relationship between the orchards and the people who support them. Rather than taking pictures in a conventional way, I wanted the process to reflect this symbiotic relationship between the people and the orchard, to highlight the fact that without restoration, many of these orchards will no longer exist. And that is how I came to the idea of making cameras out of the apples at each orchard and photographing people with them. Just over half a mil. That's really high. Using these site-specific cameras, I photographed people involved in these orchards, employees, volunteers, as well as people who are supporting them, like city councils and local communities, with the fruits of their labour, quite literally. Oh, yeah, that's great, yeah. And then, okay. Just stay like that, that's perfect, yeah, stay like that. Ready? 1, 2. Right, that's 2. 1, 2. I've tried food colorings, duct tapes, and even acrylic paint. In the end, I settled on the current configuration. What I really like about this is that everything used to create the cameras is non-destructive, which means the fruits are still somewhat intact after they've been used. Just as every orchard that is restored is unique, so is every apple. You can't be certain how each photograph will turn out, and that makes each review full of surprises.
So as you can see, I worked closely with the Orchard Project for this piece of work, documenting all the remaining orchards around London. The reason I looked into this is because I was born and raised in Hong Kong, but I've lived in London pretty much half of my life. As a result of that, I've always been very interested in community, looking for that sense of belonging. And when I discovered that there are actually urban orchards around where I live, I got very curious and I started looking into it. And started trying to find a way to capture all these people who are keeping all these wonderful places alive. I also looked into the kind of history of the statistics of like all these places throughout in the country. So only 31% of the eating apples in the UK are homegrown these days. And around 60% of England's traditional orchards have disappeared in the past 70 years. London especially has lost almost 98% of its orchards in the past century. All of these are very much symptomatic of a society that is chasing economic growth and forcing out nature in exchange of that. And then I started to look into why are they important? What is the importance of these places? Spoke to Stephanie during when I was working on the project. You know, these places are havens for wildlife, but it's also calm places for people to go to relax or get together and celebrate nature and fruits. Or according to Tony as well, in the city, not everyone has the luxury of a garden. So having orchards and all these greens outdoor space helps a lot of children to understand how things grow and see and be in touch with nature. So I decided it's a worthwhile cause to celebrate all these, you know, all the work that people are doing to keeping these places alive. So instead of just showing up with a camera, I wanted the subject to be also the integral part of the work. And that's why I experimented with photographing with apples themselves. The mechanics themselves are quite simple. It's just a traditional pinhole camera, one of the most basic form of cameras. But by turning, I like this process, turning the apple, the fruits into camera. We're turning it onto itself. We're seeing through its own gaze. You know, the trees are there, and the apples are now looking back at people who are keeping, you know, making it possible for them to exist. In my head, it completes the circles, because without the people, there will be no orchards. Without the orchards, there will be no fruits. And now without the fruits, there will be no pictures, no portraits. This kind of tapping into the essence of the process itself is also reflected in the project title. What do you see, oh apple tree? I was trying to mimic the wassailing songs. I looked into the wassailing song when they drink cider and they will dance around a tree and have these poems in these simple rhyming sentences. I wanted to kind of, is a nod. What do you see, oh apple tree? Is a nod to that kind of tradition. Each of the cameras is site specific, and they were picked on the spot, and then they were made, turning the cameras on the spot. So they're quite fiddly to make. Each of them takes about 15-20 minutes to make, and there's one shot per apple. And most of the time I wouldn't even be able to tell where exactly I was pointing the camera at. But as part of the fun of it, one-off portrait for each person. And some gives you these unexpected compositions. Oh, that was taken in Angel on a Sunday. Don't know whether you can make out who that is. But that is Jeremy Corbyn at the Gillespie Park Apple Day. That was a while ago now, way before last December. So it used to be a lot cooler, this slide. So as soon as the pictures came out, the first picture came out, I realized that the photographic image is not just what is exposed in the middle of it, but the layering of everything that tells the whole story, including the ragged edge that comes from the knife I cut into apple, the paper lining, and even the film sprocket hole itself, the bits that sticks out on the side. You can see the light leaks, all the little imperfection forms the image. All these layering, the dust and the scratches as well, gives you a picture that is imperfect is perfect in the way that is imperfect, if you will. In a way, it's each little camera is a collaboration with the apple. I got to know my varieties quite well. Obviously, the smaller ones are always harder to turn into a usable camera. Bramley, for example, nice and crunchy and big, makes for a lot more maneuver rooms. These are some early experiments I did when I was testing out the idea. Carving it from the front didn't quite work out. Realized that you need to black out a whole apple, and it's quite tricky to do in the wild. Duct tape, not that elegant. Food dye just got really messy. So in the end, it was those bar napkins, the black bar napkins that I found too. The whole thing became a bit like a picnic, because I had to wrap everything in tin foil, put them in a lunchbox when I'm done. Had many apple crumbles for dessert during those few months. That's Stephanie, who's my main contact at the Orchard Project. I photographed quite a few of the teams. Not all of them turned out as well as I had hoped them to, but that's part of the game. I also set the rules for myself. I didn't want the apples to be wasted after the fact. So that's why it was important to me that using tin foil, using non-destructive methods to make them into cameras so they're still edible afterwards. Because otherwise, it's just a little. it just would feel a bit odd to me if I were to celebrate the fruit and then end up wasting about 20 of them each day I go out. Sometimes really happy accidents happen. I don't know what that is at the bottom right corner. It's definitely not part of the photograph, but because of some light leak, some sort of blockage on the negative itself, it gives this echoey, almost like an extra tree branch that appears outside of the photographic frame. And the work itself, it's not just about the people, the portraits, but also the apples themselves. So here's one team pictures I took of some of the cameras I made throughout the project, a good range of them. The lenses were reused, but the apples are very much one-off. And the work has been fairly well received, and it's traveled to quite a few places, further afield than I ever imagined they would. So that was the launch back in Herne Hill, but then it also went to Switzerland, and I was very, very glad to be able to show a project in the context where it's back out in the woods again. And through the eyes of these apples, I set out to reconnect people to the beauty of these forgotten places, and hopefully also make people rethink our relationship with them, with nature, between urban and nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. That was wonderful, and I'm really pleased that you've, in a really fascinating project, connected the people and the places so intimately with both your kind of methods and your approach and your sort of consciousness about ensuring you're not wasting things as well. So thank you for that. So another fascinating presentation, very different, but I think complementary to the previous two from Peter and Jo. We've got a few minutes for questions, and we've got some questions rolling in, which is fantastic. So do please keep them coming. I'm going to try and group some together because we are pressed for time. And I'm going to start off by perhaps asking some questions relating to land. So Rich and Mark and Paul are asking about how do communities identify land that might be suitable for new orchards? How do allotment managers react to proposals to add fruit trees or orchards? And David Kerry's asking a related question really about community ownership agreements. What's the best model without paying huge lawyers' fees? So I don't know, Jo, whether you have any reflections on access to land.
Yeah, land access is really important. It also links in with that question about pollution as well. So in terms of allotments, it very much depends on the managing group for that allotment. So there are lots of examples of allotments in London anyway that have got fruit trees on them, but it just depends on the rules. You know how allotments associations say you can't plant any trees at all, and then other allotments it will be allowed. So yeah, you would need to speak to the managing group for that particular allotment. In terms of land agreements, I don't have an enormous amount of experience with that, but with the project I mentioned before, Edwall Landscapes in Finsbury Park, we basically have an agreement with the council to use that piece of land, so sort of a right to occupy. So I guess you just need to negotiate with whoever you find the landowner, whoever the landowner is. There's an advocacy service. I can't remember what they're called. Is it the Land Trust that helps people kind of find land and who owns it, and puts people in touch so that they can have access to land. But yeah, in terms of pollution, which I think was, shall I talk about that, Neil, as well?
Yeah, there was a question that you've answered in writing, but a question about toxicity and the extent to which urban orchards might suffer from, and fruits therefrom might suffer from toxicity related to soil or air pollution.
Yeah, it's a massive issue in London in particular to do with lead. because if you look at a map of lead pollution throughout the UK, it's very concentrated in London because of our industrial past and the high concentration of cars in the past. So if you're wanting to move an orchard towards a polyculture, you would definitely need to test your soil to check to see what toxins are in there and if there's any lead. If you're planting an orchard in soil that's polluted with lead, you don't need to worry about it too much, because it physically cannot make its way to the outlying tips of branches where the fruit is forming, and fruit forms relatively quickly. So there isn't an issue with it accumulating in fruit in the way that there would be with, say, lettuce if you grew it in polluted soil. So yeah, get the soil tested. Or as we both know, Neil, there's if the soil is polluted, what they did in Stratford was they basically put a barrier and then imported a ton of soil to grow into. So that's what orchards do sometimes. So Mabley Green in Hackney, they dug metre deep trenches and lined them and then filled it with soil from sugar beet farms, and then planted trees and shrubs and herbaceous perennials into that. So yeah.
Thanks, Jo. I don't know, Peter or Derek, whether you've got anything to add, but there is a question for you specifically, Derek, about have you approached a certain chief exec of a well-known IT company about your project?
No, but I'm always open to that if you can put me in touch.
Thanks. Peter, any thoughts about access to land? And there is a question here about, or there has been a question asked about, why is harvesting mulberries such a messy business?
Yeah, I saw somebody answered that, and I just typed a little question thing. They're very juicy, and there's a dark red purplish juice that tends to get all over your hands and all over your clothes if you're not careful. It does wash out though, but also a tip that I've learned is that if you take an unripe berry, and very often there are some unripe ones next to the ripe ones, and crush it and rub the juice into the stain, it will actually dissolve it, and it tends to be very easy to remove then, just wipes off. Also, I believe leaves, if you crush a leaf, you can also rub it in. That's a tip. But their beauty and their juiciness is what makes them messy to harvest, but it's great fun. You just have to be prepared, that's all.
Thanks, Peter. Jo, you had something to add.
No, it was a question for Peter actually, about the smaller mulberries, the white ones, because we have a couple growing at Edible Landscapes which seem to be developing small fruitlets, and I'm wondering if is that the same type of mulberry that, because in the Turkish shops near where I live in Finsbury Park, you basically can buy dried mulberries that look very small, and they're very sweet, they're very delicious and chewy and nice. I'm wondering if those are the white mulberries, or if there's something else.
The thing about white mulberries and black mulberries is there is one particular variety or species of a cultivar, I should say, of white mulberry that has white fruit, but there are many, confusingly, that have black fruit. Morus Makura, various others have black fruit, which is also very delicious. It's not quite as sweet as the black fruit. But the Turkish mulberries, when their silk industry collapsed with the pebrine silkworm illness in the 19th century, Turkey didn't uproot all its trees, but kept them to grow fruit, which it now has become they kept the silkworm trees, the white mulberry trees, for their fruit, and they dry very well, and you can buy them from Turkey, from Thailand, and there's an industry of mulberry fruit, but it's not the same as the black mulberry, which you can't dry and you can't keep unless you turn it into jam or juice.
Well, that's really cool. So I can buy them on green lanes, and it's the same thing. I can grow them in Edible Landscape, or you can grow them here as well.
If you want to, yeah. They're better dried probably than they are fresh. Actually, those ones, the white mulberries.
Thanks, both.
Do you ever eat the leaves, Peter, as well?
Well, I haven't, but I saw your thing that you can actually know, and they're full of goodness. They're full of all kinds of things, and they were used as part of the kind of medicine cabinet going way back into Roman and Greek times.
Thanks both. A few questions from audience here that we need to get to, but before doing so, I've noticed in the chat panel that somebody called Annie Lord from Edinburgh's just launched a project called The Neighbouring Orchard, which aims to create a network of socially distant apple trees in front gardens and shared spaces across different areas of Edinburgh. So that sounds like a very timely project and very interesting too. And also some very complimentary comments to you, Derek, about your beautiful and inspiring project. But coming back to some of the remaining questions here, there's a question here from Liz about suggesting that there might be scope for an accredited training course for furloughed workers who have little prospect of returning to work until next year. I don't know whether, Jo, you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, the course that we're starting, I mentioned that it's for unemployed and economically active, and you're wondering if you fit into that category or not. We have to give, so we're getting the money from European social funding, and you have to give evidence for people's kind of status. So I think you would have to evidence that you were economically inactive in some way if you weren't officially unemployed. So it may be possible, yes. But if you want to do that, you need to book soon, because there's only 2 spaces left on that training course. And all the training is based in Redbridge, mostly at Forest Farm Peace Garden. So yeah, get your skates on.
Thank you. There's another question here, which I'm going to slightly widen out. It's from Chrissy Pope saying, do you have any plans to move into Kent? It's an issue really about, you know, there's lots of areas of the countryside where, you know, rural communities would like to have access to local community orchards. And I'm wondering, given the focus on the urban areas of the orchard project to date, whether or not there's any scope for moving beyond the urban into the rural.
Yeah, there is. And so I mentioned earlier that we're opening an office in Swansea, and I was involved in the scoping study for that. So we were looking at Cardiff and Swansea, and ended up choosing Swansea because they've got some fantastic community groups near there. And part of that, we had this whole conversation about, well, what's urban? You know, what does urban mean? And we ended up thinking that it could include just any economically deprived area, you know, because that's kind of near a conurbation. And so on that particular project, we'll be going much further out. And in our projects in Manchester and Edinburgh, we do kind of, the reach does spread beyond just the city centre, because yeah, you're right, everyone wants to have access to orchards. I suppose somewhere like Kent or Somerset or Devon, you would think that there's already, I would imagine that there's already quite a thriving orchard culture going on, but perhaps that's mistaken. We don't, but yeah, in answer to the question, we don't have immediate plans to move anywhere beyond our existing places at the moment.
Right, thank you. Just one more, we're I'm afraid going to run out of time very soon. One question here from Jenny Morgan, who is from the Southwark Nature Action Volunteer Network. They've just set an umbrella group for the Friends of Burgess Park, and they want to set up a green corridor between 4 parks in the area. So I suppose a general question really about how to go about getting advice or permission from local authorities for street planting or planting on council estates. Jo, perhaps for you, I think, again, unless people...
Yeah, although I reckon you could probably answer that just as easily, Neil. But yeah, it's just liaise with the local authorities to find out. I love Burgess Park. I think it's fantastic. There's a really good project there that we sometimes do our training at. And yeah, green corridors, brilliant. You just need to link up with your local councillors to get buy-in from them, and then the council officers to find out what their biodiversity plans are, because that's probably what you'll be tapping into, is whatever plans they've got, their own plans to kind of boost biodiversity. And yeah, just mobilise from the top down, and make sure that you've got a reasonably strong community group. Although it sounds like you've just started one. So yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jo. I'm gonna. We need to wrap up in a minute or two, so I'm just going to ask one brief question, final question of all the panelists, really. CPRE London, along with other environmental groups, has put together a green manifesto for the next mayor of London. Some of you will be aware that the mayoral elections were postponed from this year to next year. But our manifesto, called A More Natural Capital, calls for 150 new community orchards across London to be supported by the new mayor of London, the next mayor of London. I'm going to ask each panelist, really, what single action do you think the mayor might be able to take in order to help deliver that aspiration? I don't know who's most prepared to chip in. You can be very brief. Jo, how about you?
That's really hard to pin it down to a single action. So it sounds like you're saying like a policy thing that would actually enable that to happen. For me, the biggest reason why, there's two main reasons why they may fail. A, it's the community group. So people underestimate the importance of having a strong, resilient community group. So there should be built-in support for the actual group's own strength, but also water and aftercare. So access to water is overlooked often when planting new orchards. So I would say those, sorry, it's two things and not one.
That's great, thank you. Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm always, as you know, interested in the heritage side, you know, the historic side of things. And if there's any way to revive and to restore, and as the Orchard Project is doing, community orchards, I think that would not only be very, very historically interesting for the local community, but would be a rallying point as well for local people to give them a lot of pleasure as well.
Good point. And Derek, do you have any thoughts on this?
I just would like to add that from my experience of showing my project around, majority of audience who are like around, you know, in the 20s or 30s, they were not aware of the existence of urban orchards at all. So I think awareness as a whole, once they found out about it, everyone is very keen on the idea, everyone is spoken to. So I think just general awareness campaign would be very, very great boost.
Thanks a lot. Excellent. All excellent points. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for your questions. Thanks in particular to the panelists for some wonderful presentations and images. Really exciting. And I'd just like to finish by reminding everybody, as I've been reminded during the course of this session, that it is the 30th anniversary of National Apple Day in October, on October the 21st this year. So let's see if we can make that a date where we can rally round and promote the benefits of urban orchards more widely. Thanks everyone for coming, and if you enjoyed the webinar, please come to our final sessions. There's one at 5:30 this evening on living with trees in the city with none other than Paul Wood and Robin Walter, who's written a book called Living with Trees that's due to be published soon by Little Toller. And tomorrow, the finale is a session on great trees, including a focus on great trees of London with a host of really excellent speakers as well. So come along to those if you're not already signed up. Thanks everyone for coming today, and look out for us next year.
Thank you. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.